In the quiet suburbs of a small town, David had everything he ever wanted: a beautiful wife, a home, and a future full of promise. But everything shattered the moment he uncovered a secret so shocking it would change his life forever. What began as a perfect marriage quickly changed into a nightmare of betrayal, confusion, and horror. The truth, hidden beneath the surface of his young wife Lily's past, would push David to a breaking point that no one could have foreseen. It was early summer, in June 2019, when David and Lily stood together at the altar in a small chapel just outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. Their wedding was modest, with close family and friends in attendance. David, 28 years old, had always been a private man who didn't make many connections outside his immediate circle. His bride, Lily, was 17. Young, but she carried herself with a maturity that belied her age. Their relationship had been fast-paced, a whirlwind romance that started when Lily moved into town 6 months earlier to live with a distant cousin. David's family was initially skeptical. His mother had expressed concerns about Lily's age, but David assured her that Lily was wise beyond her years. She had a quiet charm, a delicate presence that seemed to put everyone at ease. Lily rarely spoke about her past, saying only that she had a difficult childhood and wanted a fresh start. David saw himself as her protector, someone who could give her the stability and love she deserved. The newlyweds moved into a small, 2-bedroom house on the outskirts of the city. It was an older home with creaky floors and peeling wallpaper, but David took pride in it. He had saved up for years to afford the down payment, and now it was their first home together. Lily seemed content, spending her days tidying up the house, cooking meals, and occasionally venturing out to the grocery store. At first, everything seemed perfect. David worked long shifts at the local factory, and each night he would return home to a warm meal and a smiling wife. Lily had a knack for making the simplest moments feel special. They would sit on the porch after dinner, watching fireflies light up the yard, and David would think to himself how lucky he was to have found someone like her. But as the weeks went on, David started to notice small inconsistencies. Lily had strange habits that didn't add up. She would always lock the bathroom door, even when she was alone in the house. Her wardrobe consisted of baggy clothes that concealed her figure, and she seemed to avoid intimacy, offering vague excuses whenever David tried to get close. He told himself it was her youth and inexperience, that she needed time to feel comfortable. One evening, while Lily was out running errands, David decided to surprise her by organizing her closet. He wanted to make room for some new clothes he had planned to buy her as a gift. As he pulled open the drawers, he found something that made him pause: a small envelope tucked away at the back of the dresser. Inside were a few crumpled documents. One was a faded birth certificate with a name that wasn't Lily's. Another was a medical record with unfamiliar terminology that David couldn't understand. His heart sank as he stared at the papers. Questions flooded his mind, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. When Lily returned home that night, he didn't mention what he had found. Instead, he watched her closely, searching for signs of dishonesty in her behavior. She seemed normal, smiling and chatting about the neighbor's dog that had followed her home from the store. Over the next few days, David couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He decided to dig deeper. While Lily was in the shower, he searched through her belongings again, this time more thoroughly. Hidden beneath a stack of old magazines, he found a small, locked box. The key was nowhere to be found, but David was determined to open it. He pried it open with a screwdriver and discovered its contents: an old passport, more medical records, and a prescription bottle with a name that didn't match Lily's. The passport photo showed a person who looked like Lily but with shorter hair and a different name. The medical records referenced procedures that David didn't understand, but one word stood out: hormone therapy. David's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he had found. He felt a mix of confusion, anger, and betrayal. That night he couldn't sleep. Lily seemed oblivious to his growing unease, but David knew he couldn't keep quiet for long. The following day, David decided to confront Lily. He left work early and waited for her to return from her errands. When she walked through the door, he was sitting at the kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of him. The confrontation was brief, and Lily's reaction was one of sheer panic. She broke down in tears, confessing everything. Her real name was Liam, and she had been born biologically male. She explained that she had been transitioning for years and that her family had disowned her because of it. Moving to Cincinnati had been her attempt to start over, to live as the person she felt she truly was. David was stunned. He felt a surge of emotions: anger, disbelief, betrayal. He couldn't comprehend how someone he loved and trusted had kept such a monumental secret from him. Lily begged for his forgiveness, explaining that she had been terrified of losing him if he knew the truth. Davy's reaction was immediate and explosive. He stormed out of the house, leaving Lily sobbing on the floor. He drove aimlessly for hours, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't fathom how this had happened to him, how he had married someone without truly knowing who they were. When he finally returned home, the house was dark and silent. Lily was nowhere to be found. David searched every room, calling her name, but there was no response. That's when he noticed the back door was slightly ajar. He stepped outside and saw her standing at the edge of the yard, near the woods that bordered their property. She was holding something in her hands, though he couldn't make out what it was in the dim light. As he approached, she turned to face him, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. Anger consumed him, and in the heat of the moment, he lunged at her. They fought, and he hit her on her head before he realized what he had done. Lily lay motionless on the ground. Want more intense and gripping stories like this? Hit subscribe and you'll get access to exclusive content and upcoming giveaways. Don't miss out on the excitement. Panic set in as David stared at her lifeless body. He knew he had gone too far, that his life would never be the same. He dragged her body into the woods and buried her in a shallow grave, hoping no one would ever find out what had happened. For weeks, David carried on as though nothing had happened. He told neighbors that Lily had left him, that she had decided to move back with her family. People believed him, though some whispered about the suddenness of her departure. But secrets have a way of surfacing. Months later, a hiker stumbled upon the shallow grave in the woods. The police launched an investigation, and it didn't take long for the truth to unravel. David was arrested and charged with murder. During his trial, the courtroom was packed with spectators, eager to hear the details of the case. David's defense argued that he had acted in a moment of blind rage, but the prosecution painted a picture of premeditated violence. In the end, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The story of David and Lily became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of the consequences of secrets and the fragile nature of trust. It was a story that shook the community to its core, leaving everyone to wonder how such a promising beginning could end in such a horrific tragedy. David sat in his cell as the days turned into weeks. The weight of what he had done was unbearable. His mind replayed the night over and over like a never-ending loop, and he could never escape the haunting image of Lily lying lifeless in the woods. The silence of his cell was broken only by the faint sound of voices and shuffling footsteps echoing through the prison corridors. Despite his conviction, part of him still struggled to grasp the full reality of his situation. He had once been a free man, a husband, and now he was nothing more than a prisoner and a murderer in the eyes of the world. As the trial gained traction in the media, details of David and Lily's relationship began to surface. Reporters dug into their brief marriage, turning over every stone in search of a story. The public was both captivated and horrified. Lily, or Liam as her documents revealed, became a figure of sympathy for some and a source of controversy for others. People debated whether Lily had been wrong to keep such a secret from David. Some claimed she had deceived him, while others argued that her truth was hers to reveal on her own terms. The prosecutors, however, kept the focus on David's actions. The physical evidence, the autopsy report, and David's confession painted a clear picture of what had transpired. Forensic analysts testified about the struggle between David and Lily, detailing bruises and injuries consistent with a violent altercation. David's defense team fought to portray him as a man who had acted impulsively in a moment of emotional turmoil. They called psychologists to the stand to explain how the shock of Lily's confession might have triggered a violent outburst. They argued that David had no history of violence and that his actions were out of character. They pleaded for leniency, hoping the jury would see David as a man who had simply lost control in an unimaginable situation. But the jury couldn't overlook the brutality of the crime. The image of a husband killing his wife, regardless of the circumstances, was too bad to excuse. The prosecution emphasized that Lily had trusted David, that she had opened up to him in a moment of vulnerability, only to have her life violently taken away. They reminded the court that no amount of betrayal or shock could justify murder. The verdict was inevitable. David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His family, who had once embraced Lily with open arms, now lived with the shame of his actions. His mother, who had been skeptical of the marriage from the start, broke down in tears when the sentence was read. She had lost not only her son, but the image of the kind, loving man she thought he was. Lily's cousin, the only family member she had in Cincinnati, sat quietly in the back of the courtroom throughout the trial. She declined to speak to reporters, her face a mask of grief and exhaustion. She was left to deal with the painful reality that Lily's life had been cut short in such a senseless way. She arranged a small memorial service for Lily, where a few close friends gathered to say their goodbyes. There were no grand gestures, no lengthy eulogies, just a quiet acknowledgement of the life Lily had tried so hard to rebuild. After the trial, the story continued to gain attention. True crime podcasts, documentaries, and social media discussions dissected every aspect of the case. People speculated about David's mental state, Lily's decision to keep her past a secret, and the cultural and societal pressures that had played a role in their tragedy. It became a case study in trust, deception, and the complexities of human relationships. Inside prison, David found himself isolated. Other inmates avoided him, some out of disgust and others out of fear. He became a loner, spending most of his time in his cell, writing in a journal that he hoped would one day help him process his actions. The pages were filled with fragmented thoughts, apologies that would never be heard, and questions he couldn't answer. Why hadn't Lily trusted him enough to tell him the truth from the beginning? Why had he let his anger consume him so completely? And, most haunting of all, could he ever forgive himself? The months turned into years and the case slowly faded from public memory. New scandals and crimes took its place in the headlines, and the world moved on. But for those who had been closest to Lily and David, the pain remained fresh. Lily's cousin eventually left Cincinnati, unable to stay in a city filled with painful memories. She moved to another state, hoping to start over just as Lily once had. She carried with her a photo of Lily as a reminder of the life that had been taken too soon. David's mother stopped visiting him in prison. She couldn't bear to see the son she had once been so proud of reduced to a shadow of his former self. She sent him letters occasionally, updates about the family and words of encouragement, but the visits stopped altogether. David didn't blame her. He knew he had broken something in her that could never be repaired. In a way, prison became a place of reflection for David. Stripped of freedom and the life he had once known, he was left alone with his thoughts. He read books, attended therapy sessions, and participated in prison programs, but nothing could erase the guilt that consumed him. He often dreamed of Lily, her face a mixture of fear and sadness, and he would wake up in a cold sweat, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. As the years went on, David became a cautionary tale within the prison walls. New inmates would hear his story and shake their heads, unable to comprehend how a man's life could unravel so completely. Some would approach him, hoping to hear his side of the story, but David rarely spoke about it. He didn't want to relive the pain, the shame, the regret. Lily's story, however, lived on. Advocacy groups used her case to raise awareness about issues faced by transgender individuals, highlighting the dangers of societal rejection and the importance of acceptance. Her name became a symbol of resilience and the need for understanding in a world that was often judged too harshly. David's life became a series of monotonous days, each one blending into the next. He marked time by the changing seasons visible through the small window of his cell. He knew he would never leave the prison walls, and he accepted that as his punishment. The tragedy of David and Lily was a reminder of the fragility of trust and the consequences of secrets kept too long. It was a story that began with hope and ended in heartbreak, leaving a trail of pain that would never fully heal. The years in prison crawled by, dragging David further into a life of solitude and remorse. His days were filled with routine, a monotonous cycle of meals, chores, and time in the yard, where he wandered aimlessly, trying to forget the life he once had. The prison was not kind to him, the guards were indifferent, and the other inmates regarded him with contempt. He had become a pariah, a symbol of a tragic mistake, and the weight of his crime was evident in every step he took. David had come to terms with his isolation. The reality of his situation was no longer something he could deny. There were moments of clarity, where he would reflect on his actions, the moment of violence, the fatal decision that had forever altered the course of his life. It was hard for him to accept that this was the man he had become, someone capable of taking another person's life. The guilt was suffocating, and it clung to him like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. One evening, after a long day of work in the prison kitchen, David sat in his cell, staring out the small window above his bed. It was a quiet night, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel the usual anxiety that came with the silence. The steady hum of the prison settled into a dull background noise, and for a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to think about the past. He thought about Lily, or rather, the girl he had thought was Lily. Her true identity had been the beginning of everything, the unraveling thread that had led to the tragic ending, but when David remembered their first meeting, he couldn't help but recall the joy she had brought into his life. She was so full of life, so carefree and adventurous. She had smiled constantly, and the way she looked at him with those soft eyes. He remembered their first date at a small cafe, her laugh ringing out as they talked about everything and nothing at all. It was a memory that had initially filled him with a sense of hope. They had been so young, so eager to start their lives together. But things had changed. Over time, their relationship had started to feel off-kilter, a subtle tension that David had brushed aside. Lily's quietness grew, and the smiles became fewer. David had attributed it to the stress of being newly married, but now, from his prison cell, he understood the truth. She had been carrying a secret, one that she had hoped to keep hidden forever. And when that secret finally came out, it had shattered everything. His memories of that night were still fragmented, bits and pieces that refused to fit together. David recalled the shock he felt when Lily, in a moment of rare honesty, revealed the truth about her past. He remembered the look on her face, the uncertainty and fear, and the way her hands shook as she explained everything. She told him how she had once been Liam, how her body had been transformed over the years through medical procedures, how her journey had been one of hardship, self-discovery, and immense courage. She spoke of the rejection she had faced from her family and the loneliness that came with living a life so different from the norm. At that moment, David had been stunned into silence. He didn't know how to process the information. His mind raced, and his thoughts tangled into a jumbled mess. He didn't know what he was feeling: betrayal, confusion, anger, or something else entirely. But one thing was clear: he was hurt. David couldn't fathom why Lily had kept this from him. He had trusted her completely, and she had lied to him for so long. His world had been turned upside down, and the feeling of betrayal was overwhelming. He had spent hours walking through their apartment, alone with his thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. In his mind, everything she had told him felt like a lie, like she had deceived him, and in his anger, in the fury of being so completely blindsided, David made the worst decision of his life. The fight had escalated quickly. One minute they were talking, arguing perhaps, and the next, everything had spun out of control. He didn't remember exactly how it had happened, but in the heat of the moment he had lashed out. There had been a struggle, a violent confrontation, and before he knew it, Lily was lying on the floor, her life drained from her in a way he could never undo. The details of that night were still blurry to David, but the aftermath was all too clear. When he realized what he had done, the horror set in. It was like a fog lifting, and in that moment of clarity, he saw what he had become. He had killed his wife, the woman he had promised to love and cherish. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and he was paralyzed by guilt. In the days following the murder, David had tried to cover his tracks. He had acted quickly, dragging Lily's body out to the woods, where he buried her in a shallow grave, hoping that no one would find her. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. And it did. David had been arrested a week later, after a tip-off led the police to the location of Lily's body. The investigation was swift, and David's guilt was undeniable. His confession had been damning, and the evidence only sealed his fate. Sitting in his prison cell, David knew that there was no escaping what he had done. The trial had been a blur, the prosecutor's words echoing in his mind. They had painted him as a murderer, a man who had taken a life over a secret, and the worst part was that he couldn't deny it. As the years wore on, David found little solace in the fleeting moments of self-reflection. He knew that his life, as he had known it, was over. The man who had once been full of hope, love, and ambition had been replaced by a broken shell of a person. He had been stripped of everything: his freedom, his dignity, his family, and the love he had once thought was real. But more than anything, David realized that the true cost of his actions was the loss of Lily's life. There would never be a way to make amends for that, no matter how much time he spent in prison or how much he tortured himself with regret. He had taken away a young woman's future, a future filled with possibilities, dreams, and hopes, and for that, there would be no redemption. David's time in prison would continue, each day blending into the next, a constant reminder of his past mistakes. His name would forever be associated with a tragic crime, and the memories of Lily's life and death would haunt him until the end of his own. As the years passed, David's life in prison became one of complete isolation. He had once been a young man full of promise, eager to start a life with his bride, Lily. Now, he was a prisoner, shackled not only by the walls of his cell, but by the chains of his own guilt. Each day was a struggle to survive the weight of his conscience, the memories of the events that led to the murder of his wife, and the realization that nothing could ever bring her back. David rarely saw visitors. His family, once so supportive, had disowned him after the trial. His parents had come to the courthouse on the first day, hopeful that there had been some kind of mistake. But when the verdict was read, when the weight of his crime became undeniable, they turned their backs on him. It was an unspoken rejection. David had heard nothing from them since, and he didn't expect to. The grief of losing his wife had shattered any remaining connection they had. Life in the prison was harsh. David had no friends, only fellow inmates who kept their distance. He had become a ghost, an unseen figure who passed through the hallways unnoticed. He spent most of his time in his cell, staring at the walls, lost in thought. His solitary existence was punctuated by the occasional confrontation with other prisoners, often stemming from their own dark pasts. But it never lasted long. He was a man marked by his crime, and most others avoided him, fearing the stigma that clung to him. But even in his isolation, David couldn't escape the recurring nightmares. Every night, the images of Lily's death replayed in his mind, each time more vivid, more suffocating. He would see her face, the look of betrayal in her eyes as she collapsed to the ground. He could still hear her desperate gasps for air, feel the warmth of her blood on his hand. The nightmares had become so real that sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, only to find himself alone in his cell, the cold reality of his situation setting in once again. He couldn't understand why he had acted the way he did. It had been a crime of passion, a moment of unrestrained anger, but even that explanation felt insufficient. The regret was too heavy to bear, too consuming. He had killed her because of a secret she had kept from him, a secret that, in the grand scheme of things, seemed so insignificant. What had he really lost? The truth was, it wasn't about the secret. It was about his own inability to accept it. He had been afraid of something he didn't understand, and in that fear, he had destroyed everything he had ever loved. David had never been a violent person. Before the murder, he had never raised his hand to anyone. He had been raised in a loving home where violence was never the answer. But the truth that Lily had shared with him, the revelation of her past, of her transformation, had broken something inside him. He couldn't reconcile the person he had married with the truth she had exposed. The shock, the betrayal, had clouded his judgment, and in that moment of madness, he had made the choice that would change both of their lives forever. The longer he spent in prison, the more David tried to understand the nature of his crime. He spent hours reading books on psychology and criminal behavior, hoping to find some explanation for why he had acted the way he did. But no matter how much he read, no matter how many articles and case studies he pored over, he couldn't find a satisfactory answer. The truth was, there was no logical explanation. He had acted out of fear, out of a deep sense of shame and confusion, but in the end, it was simply a choice. In an attempt to cope with his inner demons, David began to write. He filled notebooks with his thoughts, his confessions, his reflections on the life he had destroyed. He wrote about Lily, about the moments they had shared, and about the unbearable guilt that haunted him. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to process the pain and the regret. But no matter how much he wrote, the words never seemed to ease the burden. The guilt remained, as heavy as ever. There were moments, rare moments, when David felt a faint glimmer of hope, a fleeting thought that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption. He thought about the possibility of parole, about the chance to one day walk out of prison and rebuild his life. But those thoughts were always quickly overshadowed by the reality of his crime. He had taken a life, and no amount of time served in prison could change that. The road to redemption, he realized, was a long one, and perhaps it was one he would never reach. David had no illusions about his future. He knew that, even if he were granted parole, he would never be able to escape the consequences of his actions. He would forever be marked as a murderer, a man who had killed his wife in a fit of rage. The shame would follow him wherever he went, and the memories of that night would haunt him until the day he died. As the years wore on, David grew older. His hair grayed, and his face became more worn, a reflection of the torment he had endured. He had lost weight, and his once youthful appearance had been replaced by the harsh lines of a man who had lived through too much suffering. He was a shadow of the man he had once been, and every day he felt the weight of his crime pressing down on him. The world outside continued to move on. News stories about Lily's death faded into the background, replaced by new headlines, new tragedies. People forgot, but David never could. He never forgot the life he had taken, the woman he had loved, the future he had destroyed. In his cell, alone with his thoughts, he replayed the events over and over, searching for some way to make sense of it all. But in the end, there was no making sense of it. David's time in prison would eventually come to an end, but the question remained, could he ever truly be free? He had been punished by the system, but the punishment that really mattered was the one he inflicted upon himself. The life he had destroyed could never be restored, and the love he had once known was gone forever. No matter how much time passed, no matter how many years he spent in prison, David knew that the true cost of his crime was a price he would never stop paying. Want to stay up to date with the most recent crime stories and updates? Subscribe now and you'll always have the latest, most detailed cases delivered right to your feed.